Denise Carter remembered the exact moment she knew her life was about to change. She was standing in front of a beautiful two-story house with a red front door and a wraparound porch. The real estate agent was still talking, going on about square footage and property taxes, but Denise had stopped listening. She was too busy trying not to cry. This house was everything she had ever dreamed of. It sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees. The lawn was green and perfect. There was a little garden near the front steps where someone had planted yellow flowers, and the neighborhood itself looked like something from a movie. Clean sidewalks, kids riding bikes, people walking their dogs in the evening light. Willow Creek Estates. That was the name of the neighborhood. It was the kind of place Denise used to drive through when she was younger, just to imagine what it would be like to live somewhere so peaceful. Back then, she never thought she would actually belong in a place like this. But here she was, 42 years old, holding a set of keys that said otherwise. Denise had worked hard for this moment, harder than most people would ever understand. She grew up on the east side of Detroit, in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than birdsong. Her mother, Ruth, raised her and her two younger brothers all by herself. Ruth worked as a house cleaner, sometimes taking on 3 or 4 houses a day just to keep the lights on. There were nights when dinner was just rice and beans. There were winters when the heat got cut off and they slept in their coats. But Ruth never complained. She just kept pushing forward, telling her kids that their circumstances did not define their future. Denise took those words to heart. She studied harder than anyone in her class. She won a scholarship to college, then another one to medical school. She spent years as a resident, working 80-hour weeks, surviving on coffee and pure determination, and eventually she became a pediatric surgeon. She spent her days saving children's lives, fixing tiny hearts and fragile bodies. It was exhausting work, but it was also the most rewarding thing she had ever done. Now, after 15 years of long shifts and careful saving, she had enough money to buy her dream home. The day she signed the papers, she sat in her car in the driveway and called her mother. "Mama," she said, her voice breaking. "I did it. I bought the house." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then Denise heard her mother crying on the other end of the line. "Baby girl," Ruth whispered. "I always knew you would." The first few days in the new house were like living inside a dream. Denise walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. She stood at the big kitchen window and watched the sun set behind the trees. She sat on the back porch with a cup of tea and listened to the crickets sing. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel: peace. The neighbors seemed friendly enough. An elderly couple named Walter and Betty lived next door. They came over on the second day with a basket full of homemade cookies and a handwritten welcome card. Walter was a retired postal worker with a gentle smile. Betty had silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled when she laughed. They told Denise about the neighborhood, about the annual block party in the summer and the way everyone decorated their houses for the holidays. "You're going to love it here," Betty said, patting Denise's hand. "This is a good place. Good people." Denise wanted to believe that. She really did, but there was one neighbor who made her feel uneasy from the very beginning. A woman who lived directly across the street in a large white, colonial house with black shutters and a perfectly trimmed hedge. Denise noticed her on the first day, standing at her window, watching as the moving truck unloaded boxes. The woman didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stood there with her arms crossed, her face impossible to read. Denise tried to introduce herself a few days later. She walked across the street with a friendly wave, ready to say hello. But the woman turned away from her window before Denise even reached the sidewalk. The front door stayed closed. The message was clear. Denise told herself not to worry about it. Maybe the woman was just shy. Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe she didn't like meeting new people. There could be 100 explanations that had nothing to do with Denise personally, but something in her gut told her that wasn't true. Over the next 2 weeks, Denise tried to settle into her new life. She unpacked her boxes. She hung pictures on the walls. She bought new furniture and arranged it just the way she liked. She even started a small vegetable garden in the backyard, planting tomatoes and peppers and herbs. It felt good to dig her hands into the soil, to create something living and green. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she stepped outside, she would glance across the street. And more often than not, she would see that same woman standing at her window, watching, always watching. Denise learned her name from Betty during one of their front porch conversations. The woman's name was Patricia Hollingsworth. She had lived in Willow Creek Estates for over 20 years. Her husband was some kind of executive at a big company, and her daughter was a sophomore in high school. According to Betty, Patricia was very involved in the homeowners association. She knew all the rules and regulations, and she wasn't afraid to enforce them. She can be a bit particular, Betty said carefully, choosing her words. She likes things a certain way? Denise nodded, but she understood what Betty wasn't saying. She had dealt with women like Patricia before. Women who smiled at certain neighbors and frowned at others. Women who decided within seconds whether you belonged or didn't. Still, Denise refused to let it get to her. She had worked too hard to get here. She had earned her place in this neighborhood just like everyone else. She wasn't going to let one unpleasant neighbor ruin her happiness, but she also knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. She could feel it in the way Patricia looked at her. There was something cold in that gaze, something waiting to come out. Denise didn't know when it would happen or what would trigger it. She only knew that eventually Patricia Hollingsworth would make her move, and when that day came, Denise would have to be ready. For now. Though, she tried to focus on the good things. Her beautiful house, her peaceful street, the sound of wind chimes on her front porch, the way the sunlight came through her bedroom window every morning, warm and golden. She called her mother every Sunday evening, just like she always had. They talked about the neighborhood, about Ruth's garden back in Detroit, about Denise's brothers and their growing families. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, listening to each other breathe. "Are you happy, baby?" Ruth asked one night. Denise looked around her living room. At the couch she had picked out herself. At the bookshelves filled with her favorite novels. At the framed photograph of her mother hanging above the fireplace. "Yeah, Mama," she said softly. "I really, But even as she said the words, she couldn't stop herself from glancing out the window. Across the street, a single light glowed in Patricia Hollingsworth's upstairs room, and somehow, Denise knew that her peaceful new life was about to be tested. The trouble started small. So small that Denise almost missed it at first. It was a Tuesday evening about 3 weeks after she moved in. Denise had just come home from a long shift at the hospital. She was tired, the kind of tired that settles deep in your bones. All she wanted was a hot shower and a quiet dinner. But when she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something tucked under her windshield wiper. It was a note. Typed, not handwritten. No signature at the bottom. The note said that her car was not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. It suggested that she consider parking in her garage instead of the driveway, where it was visible to other residents. Denise stood there in her driveway, reading the note twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Her car was a black luxury sedan. It was clean, well-maintained, and only 2 years old. There was nothing wrong with it. But apparently someone thought it was too flashy. Too much. Too something. She crumpled the note and threw it away. She told herself it was nothing. Just some busybody with too much time on their hands, but then it happened again, a week later. Denise received an official letter from the Homeowners Association. The letter informed her that a complaint had been filed about her outdoor lighting. According to the complaint, the lights on her front porch were excessively bright and were causing a disturbance to neighboring properties. Denise walked outside and looked at her porch lights. They were the same lights that had been there when she bought the house. The previous owners had installed them. Nobody had ever complained about them before. She wrote back to the HOA, explaining the situation. She even offered to replace the bulbs with something dimmer if it would help. The HOA responded with a form letter thanking her for her cooperation. But Denise knew this wasn't really about lights. It wasn't about her car either. Someone was sending her a message, and she was pretty sure she knew who. The next incident was harder to ignore. Denise's younger brother, Terrence, came to visit for the weekend. Terrence was 35, a high school basketball coach back in Detroit. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a deep laugh that could fill a room. Denise hadn't seen him in months, and she was excited to show him her new house. They spent Saturday afternoon cooking together in her kitchen, just like they used to do when they were kids, helping their mother with Sunday dinners. Terrence told her about his team, about the players he was mentoring, about his dreams of opening a youth center someday. Denise told him about her work, about the little boy she had operated on last week who was now recovering beautifully. It was a perfect day. The kind of day that reminded Denise why family mattered more than anything else. Then the police showed up. It was early evening. Terrence had stepped outside to grab something from his car, which was parked on the street in front of Denise's house. He was only out there for a minute or two. But that was enough. Denise heard the sirens first. Then she saw the flashing lights through her window. She ran outside and found her brother standing on the sidewalk with his hands raised. Two police officers approaching him with their hands on their belts. "What's going on?" Denise shouted, running toward them. One of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious person in this area. Can you tell us if you know this man?" Denise felt her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at her brother, standing there with his hands up like a criminal. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just getting something from his car. But someone had called the police on him anyway. "This is my brother," Denise said, her voice shaking with anger. "He's visiting me for the weekend. He's not suspicious. He's family." The officers exchanged a look. One of them lowered his hand from his belt. "Sorry for the confusion, ma'am," he said. "Someone called and said there was an unfamiliar man looking into cars. We have to respond to every call." Denise wanted to scream. She wanted to ask who had called and why. But she knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was already done. After the police left, Terrence tried to laugh it off. "It's okay, sis," he said. "I'm used to it." But Denise saw the look in his eyes, the weariness, the resignation. Her little brother, the one she used to protect from bullies on the playground, had just been treated like a threat in front of her own home. And there was nothing she could do about it. That night, after Terrence went to bed, Denise sat alone in her living room. She looked out the window at the house across the street, Patricia Hollingsworth's house. The lights were off, but Denise could swear she saw a curtain move. She didn't have proof. She couldn't prove that Patricia was the one who had sent the note about her car. She couldn't prove that Patricia had filed the complaint about her lights. She couldn't prove that Patricia had called the police on her brother, but she knew. Deep in her gut, she knew. The final straw came on a Saturday morning. 2 weeks later, Denise had decided to plant some roses in her front yard. She had bought the bush from a local nursery, beautiful red roses that would bloom in the spring. Gardening had always been her way of relaxing, of clearing her mind after a stressful week. There was something healing about working with the earth, about watching things grow. She was on her knees in the dirt, digging a hole for the first rose bush when she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up and saw Patricia Hollingsworth marching across the street toward her. Patricia was a thin woman in her early 50s, with short blonde hair and sharp features. She was wearing expensive clothes and carried herself like someone who expected the world to bend to her will. And in her hand she was holding a phone. The camera was pointed directly at Denise. "Excuse me," Patricia said loudly, her voice dripping with false politeness. "Can I help you with something?" Denise blinked, confused. "I'm sorry?" I said, "Can I help you?" Patricia repeated, "Are you the help? The gardener?" Denise felt the words hit her like a slap. She looked down at her dirty hands, her old jeans, her worn t-shirt. She looked back at Patricia at the phone recording every second. "I live here," Denise said quietly. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because I've been in this neighborhood for over 20 years and I've never seen you before. Do you have identification? Can you prove that you actually live here?" Denise stood up slowly. The anger was building inside her, hot and tight in her chest. but she kept her voice steady. "I don't have to prove anything to you," she said. "This is my house. I bought it. I own it. And you have no right to question me." Patricia laughed, a cold little sound. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the HOA, and maybe the police too, just to be safe." Something shifted inside Denise at that moment. All the weeks of small cruelties, of being watched and judged and found guilty of nothing more than existing, came rushing to the surface. She had tried to be patient. She had tried to give Patricia the benefit of the doubt. But she was done. Denise reached into her pocket and pulled out her own phone. She opened the camera and started recording. "Go ahead," she said calmly. "Call whoever you want. But I want you to know that I'm recording this too. And I want the whole world to see exactly who you are." For the first time, something flickered in Patricia's eyes, something that looked almost like fear, but it was too late to stop what had already been set in motion. Denise sat on her couch that night, staring at her phone. The video was right there, saved in her camera roll. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of Patricia Hollingsworth at her worst. The accusations. The sneering tone. The demand for proof that Denise belonged in her own front yard. Part of her wanted to delete it and move on. She was a private person. She didn't like drama. She had spent her whole life keeping her head down and working hard, believing that her actions would speak louder than any words, but another part of her was tired. Tired of being quiet. Tired of being polite. Tired of letting people like Patricia get away with treating others like they were less than human. She thought about her brother standing on that sidewalk, with his hands raised. She thought about her mother, who had spent decades cleaning houses for people who probably looked at her the same way Patricia looked at Denise. She thought about all the times she had swallowed her anger and smiled through the pain because that was what she had been taught to do. Not this time. Denise opened her social media account. She had never posted much before, just the occasional photo of her garden or a sunset from her back porch. She had maybe 200 followers, mostly friends and former classmates. She uploaded the video with a simple caption. "When your neighbor can't accept that you belong here." Then she put her phone down and went to bed. When she woke up the next morning, everything had changed. Her phone was buzzing nonstop. Notifications were flooding in faster than she could read them. She had hundreds of new followers, then thousands. The video had been shared over and over again, spreading across the internet like wildfire. By noon, it had been viewed over 500,000 times. By evening, it had crossed 2 million. People were commenting, sharing their own stories, tagging news outlets and journalists. The hashtags were trending. Denise's name was everywhere. She didn't know how to feel. Part of her was relieved that people were finally seeing what she had been dealing with. Part of her was overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She was a surgeon, not a public figure. She saved lives in operating rooms, not on social media. This was all completely new to her. The phone calls started coming in that same day. Local news stations wanted interviews. National outlets were reaching out through direct messages. A reporter from a major network showed up at her door with a camera crew, asking if she had time to talk. Denise declined most of the requests. She gave one short interview to a local station, just to tell her side of the story. She kept it simple. She explained that she had worked hard to buy her home, that she had tried to be a good neighbor, and that she didn't understand why Patricia had treated her this way. "I just want to live my life in peace," she said into the camera. "That's all I've ever wanted." But peace was the last thing she was going to get. The internet had found Patricia Hollingsworth, and the internet was angry. Within hours, people had dug up everything about her. Her full name, her address, her employer, her husband's company, photos of her from neighborhood events, old social media posts that revealed even more about her character. Patricia worked as a regional manager for a large insurance company. By the second day, the company's phone lines were flooded with calls demanding that she be fired. People were leaving one-star reviews on business pages. They were emailing executives. They were organizing boycotts. On the third day, The company released a statement saying that Patricia had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Denise watched it all unfold from her living room, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She had wanted accountability. She had wanted people to see the truth. But this was something else entirely. This was a storm, and it was growing bigger by the hour. Then she started seeing the posts about Patricia's daughter. The girl was 16 years old. Her name was all over the internet now, linked to her mother's actions. People were finding her social media accounts and leaving cruel comments. They were calling her names, blaming her for things she had nothing to do with. Some of the messages were so hateful that Denise felt sick reading them. This girl was just a child. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was being punished for her mother's behavior. And there was nothing fair about that. Denise thought about her own teenage years. She remembered how hard it was to be young, how everything felt so intense and overwhelming. She remembered the bullies who had made fun of her clothes because her family couldn't afford nice things. She remembered crying in the bathroom at school, feeling like she would never escape the cruelty. No child deserved to go through that. Not even Patricia Hollingsworth's child. That night, Denise couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she had started. She had just wanted to stand up for herself. She had just wanted to be seen as a human being. But now everything had spiraled out of control, and innocent people were getting hurt. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the comments on her video. Most of them were supportive. People were calling her brave, telling her she was an inspiration, thanking her for speaking out. But mixed in with the support were darker messages. People celebrating Patricia's downfall with an ugly kind of joy. People making threats. People turning a moment of injustice into an excuse for cruelty. Denise had never wanted this. She had never wanted to destroy anyone. She just wanted to be treated with respect. She thought about what her mother would say. Ruth had always taught her that anger was like fire. It could keep you warm or it could burn down everything you loved. The key was knowing when to let it go. Denise made a decision. The next morning, she sat down in front of her phone and recorded a new video. She didn't plan what she was going to say. She just spoke from the heart. "I want to thank everyone who has supported me over the past few days," she began. "Your messages have meant more to me than you will ever know. But I need to ask you for something. Please stop going after Patricia's daughter. She is a child. She had nothing to do with what happened between me and her mother. She doesn't deserve to be harassed or threatened or bullied." Denise paused, collecting her thoughts. "I posted that video because I wanted people to see the truth. I wanted accountability. But accountability and cruelty are not the same thing. I have no interest in destroying anyone's life. I just want to be treated with dignity. That's what we all deserve. Every single one of us." She took a deep breath. "So please, if you want to support me, do it by being kind. Do it by treating others the way you want to be treated. Do it by remembering that behind every name on the internet, there's a real person with real feelings. Let's be better than this." She posted the video and put her phone away. The response was immediate and divided. Some people praised her for taking the high road. They called her gracious and wise. They said she was showing the kind of character that the world needed more of. Others were less kind. They accused her of being weak, of letting Patricia off the hook. They said she was betraying the people who had stood up for her. They said she didn't understand how these things worked. Denise read some of the criticism, then closed the app. She couldn't control what other people thought or did. She could only control herself, and she knew, deep in her heart, that she had done the right thing. What she didn't know was that across the street, in a darkened living room, Patricia Hollingsworth was watching that same video. And for the first time in a very long time, she was starting to feel something she had buried deep inside herself: shame. The days after Denise posted her second video were strange and quiet. The media attention started to fade. The reporters stopped calling. The camera crews moved on to the next story. Life in Willow Creek Estates slowly returned to something that looked almost normal, but nothing was really normal. Not anymore. Denise went back to work at the hospital, throwing herself into her patients and her surgeries. It felt good to focus on something real, something that mattered. In the operating room, she was in control. She could fix things. She could save lives. Out there in the world, everything felt messy and complicated. But in here, she knew exactly what to do. Her colleagues had seen the videos, of course. Everyone had. Some of them brought it up, offering words of support or asking if she was okay. Others pretended like nothing had happened, which Denise actually appreciated. She didn't want to talk about it anymore. She just wanted to move forward. But moving forward wasn't as easy as she had hoped. Every time she pulled into her driveway, she found herself glancing at the house across the street. The white colonial with the black shutters. Patricia's house. The curtains were always drawn now. The lights were rarely on. It was like the house itself was hiding from the world, Denise heard through. Betty that Patricia had barely left her home since everything happened. Her husband was handling things, whatever that meant. Her daughter had been pulled out of school temporarily because of the online harassment. The family was in crisis, locked away behind those closed curtains. Part of Denise felt a grim satisfaction. Patricia had brought this on herself. She had chosen to be cruel, and now she was facing the consequences. That was how the world worked. Actions had reactions. Choices had outcomes, but another part of Denise felt something else. Something heavier. She kept thinking about that teenage girl, trapped in a house with a mother who had become a national symbol of prejudice. She kept thinking about what it must feel like to watch your family fall apart because of something you had no control over. Denise knew what it was like to suffer for someone else's choices. Her father had walked out when she was 7 years old, leaving her mother to pick up the pieces. She had spent years carrying the weight of his abandonment, wondering if it was somehow her fault. It wasn't. It never was. But that didn't make the pain any less real. She didn't want to feel sympathy for Patricia. She really didn't. But she couldn't help wondering if there was more to the story. People didn't become cruel in a vacuum. Something had shaped Patricia into the person she was. Something had taught her to look at the world the way she did. Not that it excused anything. It didn't. But understanding and excusing were two different things. A week passed. Then 2. The leaves on the oak trees started to change color, turning gold and red and orange. Denise spent her weekends working in her garden, preparing the soil for winter. She tried to find peace in the simple rhythm of the work. Digging, planting, watering, waiting. Then one evening, just as the sun was setting, there was a knock on her door. Denise wasn't expecting anyone. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked to the front of the house. Wondering if it was Betty coming over with another batch of cookies, she opened the door and froze. Patricia Hollingsworth was standing on her porch. She looked different than before. Smaller somehow, like she had shrunk inside herself. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wasn't wearing any makeup. Her eyes were red and swollen, like she had been crying for days. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, looking at each other through the screen door. The woman who had been wronged and the woman who had done the wrong. Face to face for the first time since everything fell apart. "I know I have no right to be here," Patricia finally said. Her voice was hoarse and quiet. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I was hoping we could talk." Denise didn't move. Her hand stayed on the doorframe, her body blocking the entrance. Every instinct told her to say no, to close the door and walk away. This woman had made her life miserable. She had called the police on her brother. She had accused her of being a criminal in her own yard. Why should Denise give her anything? But then she looked at Patricia's face. Really looked at it. And she saw something she hadn't expected to see. Fear, exhaustion, desperation, and underneath all of that, something that looked almost like hope. A tiny, fragile hope that maybe somehow things could be different. Denise thought about her mother. About all the times Ruth had forgiven people who didn't deserve it. Not because they had earned forgiveness, but because holding on to anger was too heavy a burden to carry. "You hurt me," Denise said quietly. "You hurt my family." Patricia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I know I did. I don't owe you anything. Not my time? Not my forgiveness. Nothing. I know that too. Denise stood there for another long moment, wrestling with herself. Everything in her wanted to turn this woman away, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had caused, but that wasn't who Denise was. That wasn't who her mother had raised her to be. She stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in," she said. Patricia walked into the house slowly, like she was afraid the floor might give way beneath her feet. She stood in the living room, looking around at the framed photographs, the bookshelves, the soft lamplight. She seemed surprised by something, though Denise couldn't tell what. "You have a beautiful home," Patricia said quietly. "I know," Denise replied. There was no warmth in her voice. "Not yet, maybe not ever." But she gestured toward the couch. "Sit down." They sat across from each other, a coffee table between them like a border. Patricia kept her hands folded in her lap, her fingers twisting together nervously. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. The words seemed stuck somewhere deep inside her. "I don't know where to start," she finally admitted. "How about the beginning?" Denise said. "How about you tell me why? Why did you treat me like that? What did I ever do to you?" Patricia looked down at her hands. For a long time she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You didn't do anything," she said. "That's the worst part. You didn't do a single thing wrong. I just looked at you and decided who you were before I even knew your name." "But why?" Denise pressed. "I need to understand." Patricia took a shaky breath. "Because I was scared? Because you were different? Because my whole life I was taught that different meant dangerous. And instead of questioning that, I just believed it. I let my fear turn into something ugly." She looked up at Denise, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so deeply, terribly sorry. For all of it." Denise sat back in her chair, letting the words settle over her. She had imagined this moment so many times. She had pictured herself yelling, demanding answers, making Patricia feel as small as she had made Denise feel, but now that the moment was here, she didn't feel anger anymore. She just felt tired. Tired and sad and maybe, just maybe, a little bit hopeful. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Denise said honestly. "I don't know if I ever will be, but I'm willing to listen. So keep talking." And Patricia did. They talked for over 2 hours that night. The sun went down and the room grew dark, but neither of them moved to turn on the lights. It felt easier to speak in the shadows somehow. Safer. Patricia told Denise things she had never told anyone before. She talked about growing up in a small town where everyone looked the same and thought the same and feared anything different. She talked about her father, a bitter man who blamed all his problems on people who didn't look like him. She talked about the way those lessons had seeped into her bones without her even realizing it, shaping the way she saw the world. She talked about moving to Willow Creek Estates 20 years ago and feeling like she had finally made it, like she had escaped the poverty and the ugliness of her childhood. She became obsessed with protecting that life, with keeping everything perfect and controlled. Anyone who threatened that perfection became an enemy. "I know it doesn't make sense," Patricia said, her voice raw. "I know it's not an excuse. But when you moved in, all I could see was change. And change terrified me." Denise listened without interrupting. She didn't agree with anything Patricia was saying. She didn't understand how someone could carry so much fear inside them and let it poison everything they touched. But she was starting to see something she hadn't seen before. Patricia wasn't a monster. She was a broken person who had never learned how to be whole. That didn't make what she did okay. It didn't erase the pain she had caused, but it helped Denise understand that cruelty often came from a place of deep, unhealed wounds. Hurt people hurt people. It was as simple and as complicated as that. When Patricia finally stopped talking, the room fell silent. They sat there in the darkness, two women who had been enemies just hours before, now bound together by something neither of them fully understood. "I need to ask you something," Denise said finally. Patricia looked up, her face barely visible in the dim light. Anything. What are you going to do now? After tonight, after everything. Are you just going to go back to being the same person you always were? Patricia shook her head slowly. I can't. I don't want to. I look at my daughter and I see how scared she is, how ashamed. She's 16 years old and she's already learning that her mother is someone to be embarrassed by. I can't let that be my legacy. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know how to change. I don't even know where to start, but I know I have to try. For her, for myself, maybe even for you if you'll let me. Denise considered this for a long moment. Part of her wanted to say that it wasn't her job to help Patricia become a better person. And it wasn't. Patricia had to do that work herself. But Denise also knew that change didn't happen in isolation. People needed support. They needed accountability. They needed someone to believe that they could be different. There's a community group that meets at the church on Oak Street, Denise said slowly. They talk about race, about reconciliation, about how to build bridges instead of walls. I've heard good things about it. Patricia looked at her with something like surprise. You would want me to go to something like that? I want you to do something, Denise replied. Words are easy. Apologies are easy. What matters is what you do next. Patricia nodded, a new determination settling over her features. I'll go. I promise. They stood up at the same time, the conversation clearly coming to an end. Denise walked Patricia to the door, neither of them quite sure what to say. This wasn't a movie. There wasn't going to be a hug or a tearful reconciliation. The wounds were still too fresh for that dot, but as Patricia stepped onto the porch, she turned back one last time. Thank you, she said quietly, for listening, for not slamming the door in my face. You didn't have to do any of that. No, Denise agreed. I didn't? Patricia nodded, accepting this. Then she walked across the street to her own house, disappearing through the front door without looking back. Denise stood on her porch for a long time after that, looking up at the stars. She thought about her mother, about the lessons Ruth had taught her, about strength and grace and the courage it took to choose healing over hatred. She wasn't sure she had forgiven Patricia. She wasn't sure she ever would. But she had done something that felt even harder. She had opened a door. What happened next was up to both of them. The weeks that followed were quiet but full of small changes. Patricia started attending the community group at Oak Street Church. Denise knew because Betty mentioned it one afternoon, her eyes wide with surprise. Apparently, Patricia had introduced herself and admitted publicly that she was there because she had done something terrible and wanted to learn how to be better. It wasn't easy for her. Some people in the group were skeptical. Some were outright hostile. But Patricia kept showing up week after week. She listened more than she talked. She asked questions instead of making assumptions. Slowly, painfully, she started to see the world through different eyes. Her daughter went back to school eventually. The harassment had died down, partly because Denise's second video had shifted the conversation. Kids could be cruel, but they could also be forgiving when given the chance. Patricia's daughter joined a diversity club at her school. She started volunteering at a community center. She was finding her own path forward, separate from her mother's mistakes. As for Denise, life went on. She continued saving lives at the hospital. She tended her garden and watched her roses bloom. She called her mother every Sunday and listened to Ruth's stories about the old neighborhood, but something had shifted inside her too. She felt lighter somehow, like she had put down a weight she didn't even know she was carrying. One spring morning, about 6 months after their conversation, Denise was out in her front yard watering her flowers. The roses had come in beautifully, bright red against the green leaves. She was admiring them when she heard a voice call out from across the street. They look wonderful. Denise looked up. Patricia was standing on her own porch, a tentative smile on her face. She looked different than before, softer, more at peace. For a moment, Denise didn't respond. The old hurt was still there, buried deep but not forgotten. It would probably always be there in some form. But then she thought about how far they had both come, about the courage it took to change. About the grace it took to let someone try. She raised her hand in a small wave. "Thank you," she called back. Patricia waved in return. Then she went inside her house, and Denise went back to her garden. They weren't friends. They might never be friends. But they had become something else. Two women who had seen the worst in each other and chosen to believe that better was possible. Two neighbors learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to share the same street. That evening, Denise called her mother and told her everything. About the conversation. About the changes she had witnessed. About the wave across the street that morning. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she laughed, a warm sound full of pride. "Baby girl," she said, "you done good? You done real good." Denise smiled, looking out her window at the setting sun. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the whole neighborhood seemed to glow with soft light. For the first time since she had moved to Willow Creek Estates, everything felt exactly like home.